Buenos dias. Good morning. Today, Pastor Peter Chin will share a message from Exodus chapter 12, verses 37 through 42. And I will read in Spanish, and Madison will read in English. Right? But before I read, I'll tell you a little bit about Hispanic Heritage Month, which started this week. Hispanic Heritage Month is celebrated in the U.S. between September 15th and October 15th, because many Latin American countries celebrate their Independence Days within this 30-day period, including Mexico's Independence Day on September 16th. This day and this month are important to me because of my Mexican identity, and I think it's a great opportunity for Latinos and non-Latinos alike to appreciate this rapidly growing demographic in the U.S., especially since we're often devalued or dismissed. This month is often an opportunity to celebrate some of the many cultures which make up the diverse body of Christ. Yeah, and so now let me shift over to the reading of scriptures. Hear the word of the Lord, please. Los israelitas partieron de Ramses en dirección a Sucot, sin contar a las mujeres y a los niños, eran unos 600,000 hombres de a pie. Con ellos salió también gente de toda Laia y grandes manadas de ganado, tanto de ovejas como de vacas.
The Israelites journeyed from Ramses to Succoth. There were about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. Many other people went up with them, and also large droves of livestock, both flocks and herds.
Con la masa que sacaron de Egipto, cocieron panes sin levadura, pues la masa aún no había fermentado. Como los echaron de Egipto, no tuvieron tiempo de preparar comida. Los israelitas habían vivido en Egipto 430 años.
With the dough the Israelites had brought from Egypt, they baked loaves of unleavened bread. The dough was without yeast because they had been driven out of Egypt and did not have time to prepare food for themselves. Now the length of time the Israelite people lived in Egypt was 430 years.
Precisamente el día que se cumplían los 430 años, todos los escuadrones del Señor salieron de Egipto. Aquella noche el Señor le pasó en vela para sacar de Egipto a los israelitas. Pero por eso también las generaciones futuras de israelitas deben pasar esa noche en vela, en honor del Señor.
At the end of the 430 years, to the very day, all the Lord's divisions left Egypt. Because the Lord kept vigil that night to bring them out of Egypt, on this night all the Israelites are to keep vigil to honor the Lord for generations to come. This is the word of the Lord.
Today, this is the last time I will be preaching on change. Pastor Jesse will be preaching next week to close out our series, but we've been looking at change because it's so universal. We're all facing it, experiencing it in some way, trying to make sense of it, and so it feels like something we can all kind of do together. We're all trying to figure out change together as a congregation, as a community. And today, as I did that, I wanted to really focus on what I feel like might be the very best example of change that we can find in all Scripture, and that is with the Israelites leaving Egypt. This is a massive change, and I think it serves as a model for us to learn from for the changes that we might be facing in our lives. And there's a few reasons why I think this instance of change really stands out to me. Number one is a change in location. Right, that they're going from Egypt into the wilderness. And that might not seem like a big deal, but if any of us have moved from one location to the other, even in the same city, you know what a huge transition that is. It really upends your life, and after you move, you feel like you never want to move ever again. That's how it feels, right? And so this is a massive move going from Egypt into the wilderness. It's also a change in their state. They were slaves in Egypt, and now they are free. They are sojourners in the wilderness. Their very state has changed in these very few fast moments that we read about in the book of Exodus. It's also a change in lifestyle. We read in the book of Exodus that while they're in Egypt, the people of Israel imagine that they're eating pots of meat. I don't know if that's really true or not, but that's what they say. But when they go into the wilderness, what do they eat? It's just manna. Just manna and some quail. Their entire diet was based off manna, right? Manna bread, manna pie, manna cakes, manna smoothies. Everything, if you think about it, had to do with manna in some way. And when your entire diet revolves around something, cooking changes, who cooks, how they cook, everything changes as a result. And so this is another change that takes place in this moment in the book of Exodus. Lastly, it's a persistent change. This is not just something that they're traveling for a few days. It's for 40 years that they will be in this transition. And a whole generation of Israelites will actually pass away during this time. And that's why, in many ways, for me, when I think about changes that take place, especially fast ones, because as you can tell from today's passage, this happened quickly to the point where they didn't even have time for bread to rise. So all of these things happening in a very short amount of time, a change in location, a change in state, a change in lifestyle that would persist for 40 years. This is really what change really can be. And not only is it an example of change and what change can look like, it's also an example of how change can come to change us. Because when you go through the books of the Bible that are written and describe that time, what you'll find is that this moment of change begins to define their theology and how they view God. It begins to define how they see themselves as well. For example, in Exodus 22, which is the 10 Commandments, it says this: I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. God is identifying himself as the God who brought them out of Egypt based on that change. Or Leviticus chapter 26, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt so that you would no longer be slaves to the Egyptians. I broke the bars of your yoke and enabled you to walk with heads held high. And so again, the theology of the people of Israel being defined by this change that they went through. In Deuteronomy 6:10, be careful that you do not forget the Lord who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. And so this change that they're experiencing isn't just something they're experiencing, it is shaping them. Their words for God and their reflection in the mirror is based off this change that they have gone through. And I think this is a good moment for us to reflect upon our own lives and the changes that we might be experiencing. And just for a moment, I want each of us to do this. Think about the change that you are facing or experiencing in your life. And then think about in what ways are those changes changing you or defining you. Because that's what change is going to do. We don't just experience change and then move on with our lives. We experience change and then we're changed. We're defined by it. It could be bad, it could be good. That's inevitably what's going to happen in the same way that it happened to the Israelites. When you experience change, it's going to change you. And it's good to be mindful of that. It's good to recognize that the experiences that we face are also things that transform us. And so when you think about your own life, think about that. The things you're experiencing, how are they changing you? How are they defining you? How are they transforming you in the same way that we find for the people of Israel? Now, I think this is a really important reflection, to recognize that all the change we're experiencing does have its effects on us. But I think there is more that we have to understand about what we just read in the book of Exodus, this massive change that we just read about. And that is that in some ways, it's really a transition. It's transition. Because when you move forward in this story, and you move forward in chapters, and you move forward in the books of the Bible, this is what we read in Joshua chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' aide, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now then, you and all these people get ready to cross the Jordan River into the land I am about to give to them, to the Israelites. I will give you every place where you set your foot, as I promised Moses. Your territory will extend from the desert to Lebanon and from the great river, the Euphrates, all the Hittite country to the Mediterranean Sea in the west. No one will be able to stand against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave nor forsake you. We just said that change and that transition that we saw in the book of Exodus was massive. A huge transition that would define their theology and their sense of self. And we could see that very clearly. But we should also see that it ended at some point. It was just a transition. It wasn't permanent, because after that, another change would take place. And it would be a change in location. No longer would they be in the wilderness, but they would be in this Canaan. They would be in this promised land. It was change in their state. They're no longer sojourners, but they have found their home. And in some way, they become conquerors instead. It's a change in their lifestyle, even in their diet. Because on that day they enter into the promised land, no more manna. No more manna. Now they eat from the fruit of the land of Canaan instead. And I think in some ways that's nice, but it's nice to always know what you're cooking the next day. And I can really sympathize with that. Not so much me, but my wife would sympathize, I think, with saying like, I know what I'm going to cook, don't tell me. But now it's like you have to have an entire new recipe. What do these grapes do? What do these figs do? Everything is different in that time. Their entire lives change in that very moment. And so that massive moment of change that we read about the book of Exodus is really a transition, a 40-year-long transition into another state of change. That as significant as a change in Exodus was for the Israelites, it was really a transition and not an endpoint. Huge in terms of how it defined them and how they remember themselves, but it was not the end of their story. Their story continued on, even after that massive change. This is not the only time that we'll see something similar, a change really being a transformation or a transition to something else. For example, we have the example of the Transfiguration of Jesus in Mark chapter 9. It says this, "There Jesus was transfigured before them. His clothes became dazzling white, whiter than anyone in the world could bleach them. And there appeared before them Elijah and Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Peter said to Jesus, 'Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah.' He did not know what to say because they were so frightened." Pretty much Peter is just babbling at this point. He's like, let's make tents for people, which is a strange thing to say. Then a cloud appeared and covered them, and a voice came from the cloud. "This is my son, whom I love. Listen to him." This transfiguration is a change in Jesus' state. A bit of who Jesus really is eternally is being revealed in this moment. His state next to Moses and Elijah, above Moses and Elijah, is being revealed, and God's voice is being heard. This is a transformation. This is something significant that is taking place. What's interesting is that for us as Protestants in the Free Methodist Church, the transfiguration is good, but it's actually not that important to our theology. It's not like the centering point of how we see God. But if you turn to the Eastern Orthodox Church, it is very different. I have a friend who is Eastern Orthodox, and I remember talking to him for the first time about Easter and its importance, and he said, yeah, that's great, but the real great thing is the transfiguration. And as a Protestant, I was like, what? That doesn't make any sense. But for them, the transfiguration shows them God's heart for humanity, the transformation of our lives and of the world in which we live. That's where icons come from. The icons, the Eastern Orthodox icons that you see come out of the transfiguration, that God's presence and character can be revealed to us. It is really a centering point for Eastern Orthodox faith. And so it's huge. This change is huge for people who are part of Eastern Christianity. But of course, this is not the end of Jesus' story. He's not transfigured and then the book of Mark ends, because there's another transformation that will take place later on in John chapter 20, where it says this, "On the evening of that first day of the week, when the disciples were together with the doors locked for fear of the Jewish leaders, Jesus came and stood among them and said, 'Peace be with you.' After he said this, he showed them his hands and side. The disciples were overjoyed when they saw the Lord." And so here we have another transformation. He was transfigured in Mark chapter 9. But here in John chapter 20, this is not his transfigured body, it's his resurrected body. He has transformed again. In the book of John, it tells us the door was locked for fear of the Jewish leaders, but then Jesus is standing among them. Many people believed he just walked through. The molecules of that wall couldn't stop him. He just decided, I'm the Lord of these molecules. I'm just going to walk through this door. He showed his sides and his hands, and they were healed. Still the scars were there, but healed. He is different and changed in this moment. That transfiguration change was not the end of Jesus, but he would become transformed again. This is the heart of Protestant faith, this resurrection, but in fact, it's not the end of his transformations. Because you fast forward to Acts chapter 1, and this is what we read there. After Jesus said this, he was taken up before their very eyes, and a cloud hid him from their sight. They were looking intently up into the sky as he was going, when suddenly 2 men dressed in white stood beside them. Men of Galilee, they said, why do you stand here looking into the sky? This same Jesus who has been taken from you into heaven will come back in the same way you have seen him go into heaven. Again, a transformation. This time, it's not the transfiguration, it's not the resurrection, it's the ascension. Jesus is going into the presence of his Father once again. And even this passage points us forward to another change which will take place, which is Jesus coming back. All of these changes, all these transformations in themselves are important and significant, but none of them are endpoints to the story. None of them are everything, but instead they point forward to another change and to another transformation again and again and again. I think what the stories in Exodus, but also in the Gospels, teach us about change is that it redefines how we can see change, or the words we might use to look at change. That although changes are significant, they should never be viewed in isolation. They are part of a bigger story, like chapters in a book. I think this is a better way to look at change that we experience. Oftentimes, when I think about a change that's coming, especially one that I'm not expecting or it's unpleasant, it is the book. The book of my life is about that change and about what's going to take place. I have to move, or I have to think about something else, or something's going on in my family. My entire life now is defined by that one single moment, and that is it. And I think for many of us, we get into that tunnel vision kind of thing, where change becomes everything that we see, and we see nothing else. But if you take the word change and you transform it into chapter, this chapter is before me, it really transforms that. No longer does it become this thing that encompasses your entire vision, but it takes a very different place instead. And that's what I want to encourage us to try to think about with our change. To use the word chapter in whatever we're facing. Why? Why is that so transformative for us? 3 reasons. First, seeing change as a chapter helps us to place that change into its proper perspective. Oftentimes when we're experiencing change, and I just said this, but I reiterate it, when I don't like change, I really don't like change. I will eat the same thing for breakfast every day for the rest of my life if I can. Whenever I go to McDonald's, it's just always the Filet-O-Fish. It's nothing else. I don't care what the number is, it's just going to be the Filet-O-Fish, and I never change. I've dated my wife since I was 17. I'm going to date her until the day I die. Nothing's going to change. I don't like change. And so when change actually comes, even like positive change, I don't take well, which is really weird. But it just feels like it just envelops me. It encompasses my life. My entire life now is that. I can't pay attention to anything else. My life is now this one thing that's right in front of me. And I think many of us feel that way, but especially if it's negative. Especially if you've lost your job, you've lost a sibling or a parent, or something else has fallen apart in your life, it is so easy to think, this is my life now. My life is this loss. My life is defined by this one single moment. And I know so many of us think about change in this way. But again, if you think about change and you call it a chapter, you realize there are other chapters. You've lived other chapters. You will go through other chapters. And this chapter might be a big one. And it's not minimizing how big it is. It's not trying to diminish how important that moment or that loss or that gain might be. But it still tells you this is but a chapter. This is not your life. It is but a part of your life instead. And that looming mountain, that storm that's bearing upon you becomes a storm, not the storm. It becomes a moment, not the moment. It is one of the many chapters of your life, and that is powerful. That is powerful for something that seems like a mountain to be one of many mountains in your life instead. And so I think just that word chapter tells you that. It automatically communicates this is big and there's a plot happening and something's happening, but it's not the only chapter of my life. And so I encourage you to think about that. Let that word chapter make the change you're facing just a part of your life into proper perspective. Yes, a big moment, but not the whole of your life. Don't let yourself be defined by one thing. The second reason why I think that word chapter is so powerful is that seeing our change as a chapter helps that change feel less isolated and more connected to a larger story. When we call that change a chapter, it reminds us to connect it to a larger story. Not only when we call a change a chapter, it becomes kind of equal to other things, right? It's no longer this huge thing, but it's one of many things in our life. But the other beauty of calling a moment of our life a chapter is it connects it to a story. Because that's what a chapter is, right? You can't just read a chapter of a book and then close the book, because you have to read the chapter before it and connect it to the plot that came before, or you have to keep on reading to see where it goes. You can't think about any moment in a book just by itself. It will never make any sense. It will never have any impact because you don't know the story to which it's connected to. Why is it any different for our lives? When it comes to the changes of our lives, if we look at it in isolation, of course it's not going to make sense. Of course it'll feel overwhelming, like we can't get through this because we're not connecting it to the story. We don't remember what came before and God's providence that came before. We're not remembering that this will go somewhere and God will be there after this moment as well. This is what chapters do. It reminds us that this moment, as huge as it is, and again, not to diminish the bigness of those moments, is connected to a story, your story. Your story is not that single chapter. It's not that one moment. It is the many moments of your life where God has revealed His faithfulness, His goodness, His presence in your life. That's the story. I must be preaching here. I must be saying something right. Because usually at RAC that doesn't happen. So I'm a little stunned for a moment. Hold on. Let me just shake the cobwebs out of my head for a moment. But isn't it so true? So true that if we can define the changes of our life as a chapter, we're forced to think about the past. We're forced to recollect. We're forced to connect it to God's goodness in the past and God's goodness in the future as well. It truly transforms how we view the changes that we go through our lives. Again, another powerful reason why just that word change, to call your change a chapter, is so good because it reminds you of your story. It reminds you of your story. The third reason why I think this is so powerful to think about change as chapters is that seeing our change as a chapter helps us to never forget that there is an author to that story. An author to that story. So it gives us perspective. It helps us to remember that change is just a part of our lives. And then when we call it a chapter, we remember the story. But when you have a story, there's always an author. There's always someone who writes it. I'm going to let you in on a little personal secret, and that is that I'm trying to write a second book. A second book, yeah. It's very, very fun. And I'm just going to answer the question right now. No, you can't read it. And you probably never will read it, to be honest. It's very different. It's not a Christian essay. It's not theology. It's actually a work of fiction that I'm doing for myself, just to enjoy myself as a hobby. Because my body is breaking down, and I can't do any physical hobbies anymore. I can't raise my left arm like above this plane because I have an impingement. Yeah, change. There you go. There's the season. I can't do anything physical. I've got to have it all mental nowadays. And so I'm trying to write a book of fiction just for myself, which I'm really enjoying. But I don't know how to write fiction, and so that's a learning process as well. And I've been learning how to write fiction, and there's this interesting idea about discovery writing. And I never knew about this before, but discovering writing is this idea where you create a setting, you create characters, and you create a situation, and then you just watch. And ultimately, your writing is all you're doing is you're recording what people do in front of you or in your imagination. You kind of create a tank or an aquarium, you throw the characters and the settings and this situation in front of them, and then you just write down what those people would do. And in some ways, writers who write like that are just discovering the plot. They're just like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that just happened. And I've heard of writers who use this method who will actually start crying as something happens to their characters. Their lead character might die because that's what would happen in that story. And they're shocked by this. And they begin to weep and because they're mourning something they never knew what would happen. And it's really interesting to think about writing in that way. And I've been trying to do that just a little bit, just to kind of press myself. But when I really think about it, in the end, you're holding the pen. In the end, the author has the authority. They're typing and they can delete anything they want. They are really the authority in this moment. Discovery writing is nice, but really they have authority. And that's why the word author has the same root as authority. It's the one who creates. The author really decides what happens, not the setting, not the characters, not the situation. It is always, always going to be the author. When we think about our own lives, I think we often find ourselves thinking as if we are discovery writers. As if our character in front of us or the people around us or the situation or the setting, that's what dictates the course. The changes are telling you what happens and then you weep as you experience those things. But that is not the case because there is an author to our stories and we can't forget that as believers. We're not discovery writers. We're not letting the situation dictate what happens because there is an author. As we read in Hebrews chapter 12, let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God, the author and perfecter of your story and your faith. Psalm 139, your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. The changes that we experience are part of a story, and that story is written by someone. It's not random chaos of just these events bouncing off one another and you're in the middle of it, being subjected to these things. There is a God and an author and a perfecter of your faith who is writing your story. That's the truth of your circumstances. The truth of our circumstances is what we read in Romans chapter 8, that there is a God who is writing all things for the good of those who love him. Amen? Those plot points, those changes you're experiencing are in the hands of God. And it's like when I'm writing for my character, I think, chapter 1, I'm doing this because in chapter 7, they've got to grow. And if they don't go through this bad thing, then they're not going to grow. They're not going to develop, and I've got to do that. God is doing that for each one of us. He is writing our stories. And when we call the changes of our lives chapters, we're reminded of the author of those chapters. Each and every single one of us has an author for our stories. That's why, as I conclude my part of this sermon, that's really the last thing I want to tell us, is to try to view your change, whatever it might be, as a chapter. Call it a chapter instead. And let it provide perspective, remind you of the larger story and the author of that story as well. I'm going to ask the worship team to come forward, but let's just even do that for a moment. If you want to bow your heads, just for a moment, think about that change that you're facing in your life, right? It could be with a new place to live or with family or your body, whatever it might be, but think about that change just for a moment. Think about how it's defining you. Think about how much of your time and your mind goes to thinking about that thing in your life. Just take some time to just think about that. But as you do that, think about that moment, that purchase, that loss, that transition, and call it a chapter instead. Call that move a chapter. Call that loss a chapter. Call this new job a chapter. Call the old job a chapter. And just let that sink in. Let all the implications of that sink in. Let it sink in that this is big, but it's not everything. And there are other chapters to your book. And secondly, think about the story. This one moment is connected to other moments, other things that have happened. And think about the story of your life. And then lastly, let it remind you of the author. You are not subject to your circumstances and to the people around you and to your own character. You are subject to the pen of the author, to the authority instead. And just let that truth kind of just sit with you, change your understanding of what this change looks like. Let's just do that for a moment before Pastor Genesis prays for us. Let's pray.